Welcome, come inside. And if we can encourage you to kind of move up to the front, please move up to the front. We'll give, there's a lot of people still in line for registration, so maybe we'll give them a couple minutes to come in. But welcome to Housing Washington. It's great to see everybody on the east side this year. Welcome to Spokane. I'm Carrie Williams. I'm the nonprofit and community outreach lead in the Multifamily Housing and Community Facilities Division at the Washington State Housing Finance Commission. And it's my pleasure today to introduce your instructor for the next 2+ hours. Michelle Moreland is a developer working, I think, mostly in the Puget Sound region. She has an extensive experience with all kinds of development financing tools, but especially the low-income housing tax credit programs. This session is always one of our most popular and one of our most repeat attenders come here. People in the audience, you might find yourselves having your first introduction to LIHTC, or you might have been in this business for a really long time, but no matter what experience level you're bringing, you're going to get something out of this session. I want to remind you to provide feedback. There is a way to do that through the conference app. So if you haven't downloaded the conference app yet, I think it's called Whova. Some people have been calling it Wova, but I'm going to reject that pronunciation. I'm going to go with Whova. So yeah, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle, but I'm your commission kind of host here. So if you have problems during the session, please flag me and I can try to fix them.
Thank you, Carrie. All right, I'm not going to stand too close to this other mic because I might get feedback. Wow, seriously, if you want to move up to the front, that way the people that come in later can find seats. Please feel free I'll give you a little time here while I do some introductions. Yes. Welcome, everyone. That's right. So good to see folks here. I'm not going to stay up on this stage because it's just too far away from you all and I need to kind of see your eyeballs. But I will just say a quick couple of things to start off this session. I'm Michelle Moreland. I'm the founder and principal of Lotus Development Partners. And as Carrie said, I've been doing this a little while. My firm is based in Seattle, and we are a development consultant. So what that really means is that I don't own and develop any housing for my own ownership. I work for other nonprofits primarily, and assist nonprofit owners and housing authorities and other developers, owners, in bringing housing about, and primarily multifamily. But I have been working mostly in Washington State, in a former incarnation prior to starting Lotus about 8 years ago. I also worked nationally. I worked for a national nonprofit that financed and assisted both housing and community development. So, and before that, another statewide nonprofit. So I really have been doing this for, 35 years or so. And I've learned a few things along the way. In fact, I feel like every time I do a project, I'm learning something new, even at this point. So either I haven't, not that quick a study, or things just, continually you face challenges and you have to master them and figure them out. So, but that's what keeps it interesting, right? So show of hands, I just wanted to kind of get to know who's in the room. I always like to do that to start. How many of you work with a development organization that does multifamily housing development? Wow, what are you doing here? This is Housing Washington. Everybody here for Housing Washington? So we'll keep going. How many of you work for a funder of affordable housing? Okay, A few more hands here. How many of you are in some related field like architecture or construction or banking or, well, that would be funding, insurance? Yes, yes, yes. I'm seeing architects. I need to know where you are because I just want to make sure I am very careful. I'm out of your throwing range when I say anything that's going to be crossways. Okay, and let's see, what have I missed? Service providers. Any service providers of affordable housing, supportive housing in the room? All right, bless you. That is great. So just a quick thing, I'm gonna talk a lot in general about housing and affordable housing and how and why it's different than other sort of market rate development. And I do that because oftentimes I find there are people who may have come into this sector at some point in their lives after having done maybe market rate housing development. And they think, well, how hard could this be? And always have to tell them, it's much harder. It's actually much harder. So, but they will learn that and figure that out on their own. But I do try to start with that and start to draw the distinctions between what it is to develop housing in general and what it is to develop affordable housing and why it's so much harder. But that is a lot of kind of the framework that I like to start with, just because it kind of provides a little level setting for folks. And then in addition to that, I am going to get into some of the programs that are available to assist us in figuring out how to get it done. I'm also going to talk, as Carrie mentioned, about tax credits. Because that's such a large part of what we need to understand in order to master finance. And then I'm also going to talk a little bit about the underwriting and financing process and also a little about the development process. And that is mostly just to talk about how and when we might put together financing packages and what goes first, what goes next, and kind of how you put it all together. By way of background, I have done a lot of training. And there are training series that I have done for the national nonprofit I worked with, National Development Council, which no longer exists, but was what I would consider to be the gold standard in terms of training professionals who are engaged in affordable housing development. And really, those classes were very rigorous and very intensive and had homework at the end of each night, locked you in a room for an entire week at a time. But people came away with at least enough awareness and understanding to really feel a lot more accomplished in what they're doing. And one thing that I like to say about adult learning, we're all adults in this room, is adult education is all relational, meaning you all have come in here as experts in a number of things, in things that you do. And so part of what my goal is to try to draw some relationships between the things that you already know coming into this room and the things that I know that I want to share with you. So it's really about relating one thing to another to really make those kind of new things stick. So that's something where I think this is a room full of experts who have expertise in certain areas that might be related to this. And I say this because I want to draw you out, and I would like to draw out your questions. And so this is not about me telling you what I know. It's about me making sure you know what I know and come out of this room with something more, something useful. So by way of that, I want to ask that you ask questions. Feel free to raise your hand. I'm going to jump off this podium so I can actually see you, and so that we can have somewhat of an interaction as I go through this whole next couple of hours. It makes it a lot more interesting, and it also helps to make sure that you come away with something useful, hopefully, in the end. Good? Good? Okay. I'm going to do this jumping off now because otherwise I'll fall and break my neck. So I'm going down the stairs. See this? Watch this. One time, I just have to say this as I'm walking, I was at a groundbreaking, grand opening, something like that, and they had one of these podiums like this, and it was a well-attended grand opening where the governor was there, our governor, as was U.S. Congressional Representative Rick Larsen. Both of these men are over 6 feet easily, right? So the governor had just gotten a new hip at the time, and he wanted to show off the fact that he was limber. So instead of taking the side stairs, he bounded, just charged the stage, just bounded right up to the podium, did his speech, got off. Well, not to be outdone, Representative Larsen did the same thing. So both of them trying to really show that I'm not going to do that. I walked the steps as I got up there because I thought, well, this is crazy. They put those there for a reason. So let's start, though, by talking about what I'm gonna first start by talking about what market rate housing is. And this is really, again, to draw you in and start to draw a distinction between what most people know, just when they think about housing, they've got a certain set of understandings, and we're going to start to talk about what the distinctions are between that and the work that we do in affordable housing. So when I talk about market rate housing, I think there's a few characteristics that really set it apart. One, that it is driven by what the market will pay, and that is what anybody out there consuming that product, whatever is affordable or market rate rental housing or home ownership. It's whatever the market will pay. That is kind of what the rents or the price of the sale price of the home would equal. In terms of rental housing, it also is a product, and that product is what the market is actually interested in consuming and willing to pay for. So in that way, this really describes why in certain communities there may not be a certain type of housing at all, like a scarcity of. On the west side, it's larger bedroom units or units with 3 and 4 bedrooms. Hardly ever are there, in certain communities, availability of those types of products because the market isn't willing to pay for them. So that is kind of a distinction there. The market rate housing would be what the market demand is suggesting the market would be willing to pay for. That's what developers will build. In addition, another thing that sets it apart is that the ability to raise rents is really also driven by the market, meaning that rents could escalate if there's a lot of scarcity and a lot of demand for the units. Rents could escalate pretty rapidly and at a steep pitch. So they're not capped by anything but what people are willing to pay. And lastly, and this is where I say, when I am encountering market rate developers, we have such a harder job. Market rate housing and market rate rental housing in particular is typically financed with 2 types of sources only, debt and equity. It may come in a couple of different flavors, but it's really debt and equity. Whereas what we do, as you know, could be funded with multiple different sources. So it's a lot more straightforward to finance market rate housing. By contrast, what I'm going to define, yeah, question?
I'm so sorry.
No, go for it.
I have very little financial background. I'm curious if you could define debt and equity in relation to each other.
Sure. The question is, can I define what I mean when I say debt and equity? So debt would be a loan. Debt is something that you have to borrow and pay back. And equity, this is a really good question. Equity is something that you don't have to pay back with cash money, but you may actually be paying it back by it's an investment. So the equity investor that gives you that equity may expect something else, like a return on their investment somehow, some other way. The how could be a variety of different things, but it's not a loan. So it's like a loan versus not a loan. Cool? Okay. So affordable housing, by contrast, is typically owned or developed by a mission-driven entity of some type, a nonprofit organization, a housing authority, or other mission-oriented developers. Could be for-profit developers. But they have a specific goal or mission or intent to do something that the market really isn't doing. So that's one distinction. Another is that the rents, we talked about a market rate scenario, they can raise rents as frequently as they want to, as long as there's a renter willing to pay. Whereas on an affordable housing project, we are generally going to be restricted in how quickly we raise rents, how much we raise rents. There's always going to be a cap, and that cap's coming typically from the funding sources that we use to finance the project. So it comes with strings. The strings are you can't raise rents every year at 5, 10, 20%. You really need to stay within what is prescribed for that program. That is going to, as we get into this, you're going to see that creates some tensions with how we finance things and with how we pay for everything, keeping the lights on, the operations, the whole enchilada. So rent restrictions, typically coming by program or funding source, will be a big limiter in terms of what we are able to do with these projects. Another distinction, with little to no rent escalation each year, that's actually going to be, sorry, I mixed this up. So the little to no rent escalation each year is what I've just talked about, but also restricted rents in terms of who it is that we're renting to. So those are the funding strings that say we want to actually be providing this housing for somebody at or below a certain area median income. So these are the mission or program-oriented things that the funding sources are going to dictate. And so the inability to, the certain income level that you're renting to and the inability to raise rents on a steep curve or on a as-needed basis is going to actually limit and restrict our access to financing. How we are actually going to pay for the building of the building is going to be very limited by our ability to repay, say, debt, a loan, because we can't raise rents, or we can't charge high enough rents because we are trying to serve a lower income population. So big differences, big distinctions between market rate housing on the one hand and affordable housing in the world that we live in on the other hand. But what that also means is that we are dealing with, this is the juggling, this is the sort of juggling mime juggling that you're seeing here. We deal with multiple funding sources in one project because we have to layer together all of those different programs that will be necessary to actually get a building built. Show of hands, those of you who actually have done affordable housing development. How many of you are typically working with 3 funding sources on one project? 4. He's wincing. 5. Yeah. 22 is the most at one time, 22 funding sources on one project. I do not recommend that. But it was what it took to get it done. But 4 or 5, 3 to 5 is typical. That's pretty common. So layering all those different funding sources together and making sure that you're complying with all of them, that's really a challenge. It can be a huge challenge. That's why part of why it makes it harder to do this work. Okay. I blacked out my screen. There we go. Hey, there it goes. So one of the things that we can say that's common throughout all development, whether it's market rate or affordable housing, is that development comes with a lot of risk. There are risks throughout the entire process, from start to finish, wall to wall, all kinds of different risks. But in order to manage those risks, it's important to really understand what they are first. And I can tell you that there's no way to eliminate all risk of development as you go forward in doing a project, but there are ways to mitigate the risks. So you can't eliminate the risk, but you can mitigate the risks. And so that's really what a lot of what we do is about, trying to mitigate the risks. And the funders that fund us also interested in trying to mitigate the risks. So a lot of the rules that you're going to encounter come because we're trying to mitigate risk. So when we start out a project, and I'm typically working with my clients at the very beginning, right when they have sort of that initial conception of an idea. They may be a mission-driven organization, and they may say, hey, we live to serve families who are very, very low income with kids at certain income levels in this geography, for example. Pretty specific. So if they're coming from that perspective and they start by saying, well, where do we begin? What do we do first? How do we begin this project? We will enter what we call the pre-development phase, and that process may be a very extended process. It may go on for years, a couple years, a few years, depending on if, how clear their idea is and how great their ability is to actually execute on something initially. But it's the figuring it out phase, the pre-development phase. And at that time, there's a whole bunch of things that we're engaged in doing. We may be trying to find a property. We are kind of mapping out the scale and scope of the project. We will be looking at the design just a little bit, not in detail, but preliminary. And we may be coming up with some financing strategies, multiple financing strategies, ways we could get the financing done. This whole effort that we call the pre-development phase is the riskiest, believe it or not. It's the riskiest because there's a chance that none of this will ever happen. This is just our vision, our thoughts, our dreams, whatever. We may never find a site, whatever. But we are typically at risk 100%, and any money that we spend during this time on consultants, on me, on securing or trying to tie up a property, for example, that capital, whatever it is we're spending at that time, is at highest risk of the project never coming to fruition. What you will find as a result is there are very few other participants who are going to want to be, there are very, very, very few other funders who are going to want to participate with you at that point. So the pre-development phase is really the one where the developer or the nonprofit organization is going to be absorbing most of the risk and coming up with most of the money that's going to get spent to figure things out. We're really fortunate in Washington, though, that we have one funding source in particular that is also interested and willing to support organizations in this figuring it out phase. Does anyone know which entity or which funder I'm thinking of? Oh, two, okay. Enterprise, that's one. There's more than one. There is more than one. What's another? Anyone know? Yell it out. LIHTC, Sega says, LIHTC. What else? That's two. There's three now, because both of you come up with two that I didn't. What's a third? Has anyone heard of Impact Capital? Okay. So Enterprise, LIHTC, Impact Capital. Those are three different funding sources that often are available to provide some pre-development money that helps us at this riskiest time figure stuff out. Figure out what our project plan is going to be, how many units we're going to be able to create, what income levels are we going to target, where are we getting a site, how are we going to secure the site, or at least put some money down to hold it for a few months so we figure the rest of it out. The sources to provide the financing for that really needs to be at a very sort of on forgivable terms. And so those are three funding sources: enterprise, LIHTC, and impact capital, who may be available to help with some portion of that. And absent that, the market rate developers can't access any of those. So a market rate developer, what they are using to figure all that stuff out is what? Anybody know? To figure out all of the questions that we need to answer in pre-development. What kind of money are they using? Their cash, their own cash, right? Yes, which is why a developer has to use their own cash to figure that stuff out. We may be able to access some funding source, but otherwise a nonprofit organization will also be using their own cash often to figure out these questions that we need to answer during pre-development. In addition to that, pre-development and that phase also involves what we would call implementing the financing strategy. And so what that means is we're going to figure out how much the project will cost generally and where we're going to go to get the funding to build it, to construct it. And we're then going to apply for all of that funding. So that whole process, the pre-development phases we're talking about here, as I said, could take years. We could have to go through multiple funding rounds to get fully funded on a project. We could have to go through quite a few different iterations of funding before we actually are coming away with a project that's fully funded and successful on paper. It's a long duration. Once we have a project that's fully funded, though, then we start the next phase of development, which is construction. And that phase comes with its own set of risks, a lot of risks. But again, no way to eliminate all risks, but there are ways to mitigate risk, right? So in the construction phase, which roughly begins once we get close, and when I say close, we execute the loans or funding sources and all of our financing, and then we have our building permit, and we issue a notice to proceed to a contractor. That phase then is really going to be turned over and very scheduled, should be, very scheduled, very regimented, has a very definite start, and should have a very definite finish date. Should have. But the risks during the construction phase obviously are that it costs more to build than we thought it would. So there could be potential for cost overruns, right? And those cost overruns could come from a variety of things. I have my favorite 3 buckets that I like to put all cost overrun proposals in. The first one is oops. The second one is really sorry, but oops. And the third one is oops, didn't see that coming. Generally, though, there's all kinds of different reasons why a project might cost more, and we need to be able to have something in place to mitigate those risks. Because again, if you're going to get all the money when you first start a project, that you're lining up all the money that you think it's going to cost to build it, and then you get into it and it costs more, what do? You can't just stop, right? You got to keep going. So one of the things that we do to mitigate the risks during construction are we budget contingencies. We have reserves set aside in our budget that will handle the oops didn't see that coming, and the oops, really sorry, oops. I can go into much more detail about what those are very distinct, different types of oops, by the way, and I can tell you exactly what those are. But generally, we have to have a construction contingency to handle all the oops. In addition to that, I may also need some other design problem figured out during construction. I may need some additional study done because we found contamination in the soil or something like that. So I have another bucket of contingency I call a soft cost contingency for all of the consultants that I may need to spend more money on. So there's all kinds of things you can do during construction, prior to construction start, to budget or sock away little bits of reserve, your contingencies, to mitigate the risks that happen during construction. The last reserve or contingency that we might have is for the situation where the construction runs longer, doesn't adhere to that schedule. And if part of my funding of my construction project involves a bank loan, that means I'm paying interest on that bank loan. And if I have that loan outstanding for longer than I thought I would, oops, that means more interest I'm going to be paying. So I have another bucket of reserve that I call the financing reserve socked away in my budget to make sure that if we go beyond schedule, I at least can continue to pay the bank interest. So in addition to that, the funding sources, remember we talked about pre-development. There's really nobody else hardly anybody else who's really interested in helping to participate in funding the pre-development phase. Well, during construction, generally everybody that we've lined up for funding is going to be there and available to start participating during construction. You've got your permanent funders. By that I mean your public funders. You might have an equity source, an investor, and then you will also typically have a construction lender or a bank lender. So there's a lot of different funding sources that are involved and investing during construction. They'll be providing a lot of oversight to you, which is good, generally, and their funds will be available to help cover the month-to-month costs. If we get all the way through that phase to the completion, then there is the lease-up phase. And the lease-up phase is distinct from operations, which is just the rest of your life. But the lease-up phase is that phase after you get completed and until you get to 100% occupancy. So say I'm building 100 units, I'm not going to be able to turn the keys over to 100 families right away on day one. It's going to take a little while. So that lease-up phase is really the part of which your property management company or you as the nonprofit, if you're the owner, are finding those households to come in and rent the units. And then the ongoing operations is just every year after that. So that whole phase is also fraught with risk, different types of risk, right? So there, as you complete construction, you may find that the market has shifted and you no longer have the units that are available. You no longer have a market for those. There may be fewer families or households interested in renting the type of housing that you're providing, for example. Or you may find that it's taken so long for this building to get built that there are 7 other projects out there just like it that now have flooded the market and you no longer have the high demand that you thought you did, or you're no longer kind of the only game in town. That may affect your rents, that may affect your rent level, that may affect how quickly you can lease up the units, right? Those are challenges. In addition to that, there could be, I don't know, a global pandemic or some other crazy thing that happens that it affects how quickly you're able to get people into housing units. So all of those things are risks in the lease-up phase. And in the operations phase, there's the ongoing risk every year that the costs of operating this housing might be higher than what you had budgeted for. So again, ways to mitigate those. What do we want to probably try to plan for in terms of mitigating those types of risks? Any thoughts? Reserves? Say that again? Factoring in inflation. Okay. And what about the costs of operations and how we actually handle rents, charging rents and paying for our expenses. Budgeting reserves? Subsidy. Okay, get to that in a second. Before that, though, we will budget reserves to cover any cost overruns during operations. We'll also budget a lease-up reserve to cover paying the light bill before we get the building fully leased up. So those are the types of things. Again, I'm socking away money in various places in order to manage or mitigate the risks that I know I'm going to have to encounter. So all of this to say, all of these different phases will come with risk, and there's no way to eliminate it, but there are ways to mitigate. And it's really about planning ahead. I spend a lot of time talking about rental housing because that's typically the world I know. But I'll just shift over to talk. Do we have any folks in the homeownership space in the room? Okay, I want to just touch on homeownership to say that there are similarities to this, but in the market rate or in the affordable homeownership space, what we are typically talking about at this point, instead of lease up, is how quickly can we sell these homes? And so again, that comes with risk. We may not have correctly predicted the market for those homes. And so in that case, we need to be able to have some reserves to handle how quickly or how slowly we may actually get homeowners and home buyers qualified. So again, factoring in reserves. One of the things that I mentioned earlier that distinguishes affordable housing is that the income levels that we're targeting are typically restricted by the programs that we're using to fund the housing, right? So typically we're using a HUD-described or HUD-prescribed rent levels and income levels as we're targeting our units to different income or affordability levels. So this just shows, and this is just pulled off of the Housing Finance Commission's website, where they publish the annual renewals of HUD income and rent tables. So HUD publishes these each year, very specific to your location. So since we're here, I pulled down the Spokane household income table for 2024. And this just shows how at a different income levels, 30% AMI, area median income, through 80% area median income, they have defined the income level, the maximum income level at each household size for people from 1 person to a 6-person household. One other thing I will say about this, as we are starting to build our budgets, we look at this because we need to start by knowing who it is we're serving. So this is really, for me, where I start. I don't start by designing a building and figuring out how much that costs. I start with who am I serving? I start with the people and what's their income level and how much can they afford in rent. Because everything else that I do from that point forward is going to be driven by answering those questions. So this is a part of the figuring out phase, the pre-development phase. Who am I serving? One other thing one rule that we need to follow is for the size of unit we're doing, a 1 studio, a 1-bedroom, a 2-bedroom, there is particular prescribed number of people per bedroom that we have to follow in terms of mapping out our budget. And the way that HUD works this, it goes 1 person in a studio, 1.5 people in a 1-bedroom, and 2-person household in a 3-person household in a 2-bedroom. And so there's no rhyme or reason to this, but this is just how HUD is looking at area median income, household size, and the number of bedrooms per unit. This is going to help us when we actually build our budget. So if I have, for example, a project where I'm building 1-bedroom units and I want to target people at 60% of area median income in this area, then I'm going to look up what the HUD income level is for that household size. And if it's a 1-bedroom unit, I am looking up the household income for 1.5 people, which means I'm going to extrapolate. So looking back, I have the 1.5 person household size at a 60% area median income. You can look up here on the table and it's 44,000. And so that is the income level of that household for the 1-bedroom unit. I'm going to start with that. And the other thing that we do in affordable housing is that we make sure that we are not charging more than 30% of a household income in housing expense, right? So that means I need to figure out what my rent is and what else that household's going to have to pay for. And that cannot be more than 30% of what that family's income level is. This is all to help me build my operating budget, which I start with. So in this case, I have a household that is a 1-bedroom, a household of 1.5 people. Their monthly income, 44,000 divided by 12, is 3,670. And so their maximum household payment, meaning like what they pay towards rent and other stuff, cannot exceed 1,457. So out of that, I back out what they are going to need to pay in terms of utilities. And that's what we call a utility allowance. Basically, if they are paying for their light bill and they're paying for heat, then I would need to back out a specific amount that they would typically need to pay in a utility allowance. This, again, I don't make this up. I can look this up. And it's specific to the location we are in. So my source for this, since I'm in Spokane today, is I went to the Spokane Housing Authority's website. And the Spokane Housing Authority publishes a utility allowance table. And it goes through all kinds of different things. I had to figure out what type of unit I was building to do this example. But I've decided that since the state is really interested in energy efficient buildings, I'm doing an all electric building here. So I'm doing an all electric building. That means I'm going to have electric heat and electric hot water and electric, what else? What are my other choices? Electric cooling, electric everything. So that, I looked at the table that was on the Housing Authority's website, and I figured out what components this tenant is going to pay for, and I then just applied those at $70 a month. Wow, that's really cheap. So, but I subtract that from the household payment, and so the rest is rent. This is important because this number, this tenant paid monthly rent, is what I'm going to be able to use to help build my budget. So I've really not even gotten to a housing project yet, but I'm just still focused on who it is I'm serving and what they can afford to pay. Questions on that?
The utility allowance seems very small.
Well, it does, doesn't it? Why? Why would it be this small? In this case, this would be a case where they're not paying for water, sewer, garbage. I, as the landlord, am paying for those things, so I don't need to back those things out of their obligation. So they're really not paying for, in this example, much of anything. In a market rate scenario, the tenants are going to pay for everything, right? So they would have a much higher burden of utilities than we would have here in this case, where my fictitious landlord is paying for most of those things. Yeah, Luis. You have another question? Does HUD prescribe what goes into it? No. There are certain things that are counted and certain things that are not counted as far as the types of utilities, but this would be where I would have to know, what am I providing? Like, what type of building am I building in terms of, is it all electric, as I said? If I had a building that had like heating oil as my heat, then that's a different number, and so I'd be coming up with that as opposed to the electric cost, the typical electric cost for this region, for example. So it is something where you'd have to know from your heating, from your cooking, from your water service in particular, what are the sources that are being used? Electric, gas, propane. Then you're going to go from there. So that table has a whole bunch of different choices, and I'm sort of a la carte picking from the menu to build up what I had there as the allowance. Luis, you had a question?
No, for the allowance of $20 for market rate. I know that each unit would have its own electrical home run with its own meter. For developing houses, is that the case, or is it one for the whole building?
Yes. So question is, how do we meter? You're basically asking, how do we meter the electricity? Like, for example, in an affordable, every unit would have their own electrical panel, and typically, depending on the city you're in, you would also have, say, at the ground floor, however many units I have, I'd have that many meters just all in a row, so that they all can be separately metered and read. That is not true, typically, if I'm doing permanent supportive housing, because my tenants are not going to pay any of their utilities, and I might just have one building house meter, and the landlord's paying for all that. I wanted to also say this is another place where the fork in the road between affordable multifamily housing and affordable home ownership. What is it that we're doing to build the home ownership max mortgage payment? It's not going to be rent that we're targeting here. It's not going to be rent that we're trying to figure out. It's going to be how much can the household afford as a mortgage. And if you own a home, you may be familiar with this, these terms. But basically what we're looking at here is we need to figure out first, again, what the household's maximum income is for the size of household it is. In this case, I wanted to sell a 3-bedroom house to a family that is at 80% of median income. That's my example here. And I figure out that that household is 4.5 people, because it's a 3-bedroom. 1.5 people times the number of bedrooms. So now I am at a household AMI of $81,480, which means a monthly income for that household at $6,790. So again, we don't want that household to pay more than 30% of their monthly income in the housing payment. In a home ownership scenario, that housing payment is PITI. It is the principal and interest of the mortgage payment plus taxes and insurance. So property taxes and homeowners insurance. So the PITI maximum here would be $2,000. It's 30% of $6,790. And then I back out the taxes and insurance part of that. Just made that up, 407. It's way low, way low. It's just a made up number there. But I would figure that out, and then I would get to a maximum mortgage payment. And then I'd use that number, just like I'd use the rent number, in building the rest of my the rest of my budget. Okay? All right. So this is just kind of how that operating, this is again back to the rental housing scenario, this is how that operating pro forma, we call it a pro forma or budget, starts to get built from the slides before. From figuring out the household size, number of bedrooms, income level, how much are we going to get in rent from this household. I then have to go from there to start figuring out my budget. So on the left is a typical restricted rent or affordable project. And on the right is the operating budget for a typical market rate project of the same size. So in this example, I'm going to build a 40-unit project, and they're all going to be 2-bedroom units. And we're going to work this through both ways, a market rate and an affordable approach. On the left, I have my maximum rent revenue per unit, and this I went and figured out from the rent table, which, where did that go? Oh, I don't have it up here. Well, I looked it up for Spokane, and a 2-bedroom rent at 60% of AMI, of area median income, is $1,374. So that's the maximum rent level that I can charge for a 2-bedroom. at 60% AMI. And I back out my $77, in this case, utility allowance for this project, and I get to a net rent that is a monthly net rent of $1,297. So that is how much this household is going to be able to pay the landlord in rent each month. The landlord has 40 units, 40 two-bedroom units like that. So the gross rent that they're going to get in a year is $622,000. So from there, I know how much revenue I'm going to get on this project on an annual basis from operating it. But I don't know how much my expenses are going to be. And I need to figure out also how much I'm going to have as a vacancy potentially on an annual basis. And you can't say zero, even though you think, oh, I'm always going to have these units leased. You always have to factor in some cushion. Remember, we were trying to sock away little reserves and cushions everywhere just to mitigate risk, right? So in this case, I'm going to factor in a vacancy rate. And industry standard, which is all the lenders got together and established the standard of industry. Industry standard in this case is about 5% typically. So the market would say, as you're operating these units from a year-to-year basis, you can assume that you will have some units that are always in transition and getting turned over and leasing, and maybe you'll have to do something to them after the tenant moves out. And so you're going to have to factor in some level of vacancy every year, and we would like to say that's about 5%. Now, there may be some higher, in some markets you're in, there may be some much higher vacancy rate or vacancy level, and you would need to follow that. But barring anything else, let's just call it 5% as an industry standard. By the way, where would I go to find out what the vacancy rate is in my market, in my region? Who would I ask? Anybody know? Novogradac. You might. Novogradac is an accounting firm, very, very well-known accounting firm, very good. I was thinking more generically, though, a profession. Any thoughts? Who would tell me what a market vacancy rate might be in my market? Bruh? Yeah. Property management firms. Well, maybe, if I could get them to talk to me. There's another profession who talks to the property managers and polls them, collects data, assembles the data into reports that they issue. Go for it. A market study, a market analyst, and or appraiser. Thank you. Yes. Just personal disclosure, I'm the daughter of 2 appraisers, so it's like very near and dear to my heart. So an appraiser would be gathering all that data in the marketplace about how much, what the vacancy rates are in your neighborhood or in your area or in your region. And you could always have, if you're going to get an appraisal, which you will be getting to get financing, that will be available. That information will be available in the appraisal. So I will use that appraisal to figure out whether my rents are reasonable. I will also use that appraisal to figure out whether my vacancy assumption is reasonable in the market. And I also can use that appraisal to get a gauge of whether my operating expenses are going to be in the ballpark of what other properties are experiencing in terms of operating expenses. So it's a font of information, this appraisal report that we're going to obtain to get our financing. Yeah.
When you're evaluating like a 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom unit based on the maximum rents that you can get, do you find that there's any one size of unit that's more efficient from like a cost basis?
From an operating basis?
More from, I guess, a development basis.
Oh, yes. So the question is there one or other of a type of unit size, studio, 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, whatever, that's most cost efficient economically to build? The answer is yes. You might know the answer already yourselves if you look around in the market and say, what is there a lot of? What is there not a lot of? Anybody got a guess there as far as like what is the most cost efficient type of unit to build? Studios, yep. The tinier the better, and you can still charge $2,000 a month. Yes, very efficient, very, very efficient. 4 bedrooms, not so much. You know, if kids only just had jobs more, like every one of the household members was earning, that would be better. But no, 5-year-olds, no jobs, 4 bedrooms. Yes, child labor is the answer. No, so 4 bedroom is really the least efficient. And that actually kind of goes for the operating cost as well. So we're really, you know, kind of all across the board, it is why market rate developers are not necessarily building the larger bedroom units, because they don't pay. They're not as efficient. So as we're building our budget, though, we need to understand what our operating costs are going to be. And this exercise, in this example that I'm giving you here, I'm showing you a restricted rent scenario where my annual operating expenses are going to be $6,000 a unit per year. And on the other side, you'll see that I've got only $4,000 per unit per year for the market rate developer. But behind that 6,000 or behind that 4,000 was a lot of research. I do a lot of research to build an operating budget. And the way that I can figure that out is either my client, the nonprofit, may already have projects that they're operating, and I go and look at what their annual operating budgets are, if they've got some similar units, and I can say, oh, this is how much in this area we're going to pay for lights, heating, utilities, how much you're paying for property management, how much insurance is going to cost. There's about 20 or 30 line items that go into that $6,000 per unit number. If I don't have that information, though, the appraiser can help with that, because they're surveying the market and they're looking at all these other rental properties in my market. And they're gathering the information about how much those properties are operating at and their operating expenses each year. So that's a good comparable. You had a question here?
Yeah, just curious, that revenue that comes out after expenses, operating expenses, everything that goes into running this property, does that include repaying one's debts, or is that purely money that you could do to fund your organization or like invest in further properties? I'm just kind of curious what that final number accounts for.
Hold the thought, and I will get to that answer. That is the question that we are going to be, this culminates, and this whole example culminates in answering that question. Hang tight. Question.
Just
Yeah.
as you know, to glimpse through numbers, is it normally about 1% for restricted and about 0.5% for non-restricted or market rate when you're doing the reserves? Because that's basically what it equates to.
In terms of reserves and how much I set aside if I'm in a market rate scenario versus an affordable, I don't do market rate housing, so I couldn't tell you. But what I do know is that on the affordable side, I'm going to be sizing my reserves in a very intentional way. So as I am setting up my budget, I've got my expenses, right? Did a bunch of research to get to what those various expenses are. And by the way, I'm going to be wrong about a number of these things probably, but what I don't want to be wrong about is the overall expense per unit. So that's why I expressed that expense number there as a $6,000 per unit per year. I want to be in that ballpark, whether my utilities are higher maybe or lower, whether I've undercut my property management or property expenses, property insurance costs. I want to make sure that I'm at least in the ballpark of the per unit per year number. And so that's what I'm going to be looking at and making sure that that aligns with the other comparables out there. Now, part of that number was reserves and what I'm setting aside for reserves. And how we get to that is more industry standard stuff, industry standard driven. So that's part of what goes into the math of setting my expenses and reserve budget. You had a question?
So on the appraisal, is that a
to have the appraiser tell me the information comes standard. It comes standard with the appraisal. Because what they're doing, and this is the Beyond Housing 101, this is the Appraisal 101 class, which I offer if you want to sign up for that. The appraiser is actually going to be valuing my property based on the income that it brings. That's how they actually set the value, which is why they have to know what those other properties are operating at too. It's a formula that they're going to use to work out what the value of my property is as completed. So that information about other properties' operating expenses will come in the report. You don't have to ask for it. If you're getting an as-completed appraisal, you will get that information on all the other comparables in the area. So we've just got to a comparison, though, between my restricted rent project here and a market rate project. And so I wanted to just draw some contrast here before we get to the very bottom of this table. On the left-hand side, I have a capped rent that I'm charging for these 2-bedroom units at $1,374 a month, minus utilities. And on the right, the market rent that I could charge on that 2-bedroom looks to be $1,824. And I looked that up as well for Spokane, so hopefully it's in the ballpark here. But notice that I didn't back out any utility allowance for that tenant because the tenant is going to pay all of these, and the market rate landlord is not limited in charging no more than 30% to that tenant, right? It is what it is. This is how much I'm going to charge this tenant. And by the way, they also have to pay utilities. So I don't back out a utility allowance on the market rate side. And what you notice here is on the left, you get a gross income that's about $200,000, $250,000 less than what you have on the right. Well, that's going to be a problem as we start to finance the actual construction of this project. This is going to show the fork in the road between market rate and affordable and how we have to solve for this. So after my expenses, does anybody want to ask why my expenses might be different, by the way? I have the same building on each side, market rate and affordable. I'm about $2,000 different on expenses. I'll tell you. A guess? Anybody guess?
The fact that in market rate, the tenant's gonna put a deposit and they're on the hook for everything that's wrong?
The fact that the market rate, actually you're close, Luis. The market rate expenses are less because the market rate developer is not paying any of the utilities. The tenant is paying for everything, so the market rate developer is not paying for water, sewer, garbage in this case. That's all passed through as rent payment for the tenant, so they don't have as high of expenses. Also, the market rate project may not have as many common areas amenities as we do on the affordable side, and their property management engagement may be lighter, a lighter touch. All of these things lead to less operating expenses on a market rate side than on the affordable side. So we're burdened with a lower rent we can charge, less ability to escalate that rent each year, and higher operating expenses. All of these challenges mean that we're going to have to go find other people's money somewhere in order to actually build this, because we have beyond the ability to service debt and borrow the money to pay for the building, we have to go and layer in other sources. What all of this is getting to, though, is rents minus expenses lead to that line that I have highlighted there, the net operating income, or NOI. And that is what we call the most important number in the operating budget. The net operating income is what is the most important number in an operating budget. Why? It's my net income. Okay, that's a circular argument, Jesse. Why is it so important? It's all the money that comes in. It's the cash I get to play with. Now we're warming to it. Okay, it's the cash I get to play with. Or in other words, it's the cash I have available to pay back a loan that I might get for building the building. In other words, it is what I have available for debt service, right? Okay. Wow, what a difference on the market rate side to the affordable side here, right? On the market rate, I have 671,000 available, and on the affordable side, I have 351,000. This is not going to get me as much in terms of a loan. We all agree? Well, that's the next step. So now that I know how much revenue I'm going to be able to bring in from operating this project on a yearly basis, once it's all done and dusted and up and running, I can then figure out how much I'm going to be able to borrow to build it. And this is the starting place for my, what we call capital development budget, the building of the building budget. So I've done my operating budget first, and then I'll do my development budget second. And part of my input to my development budget is, how much am I going to be able to borrow to build this building, to build this project? Well, now I have to think like a banker or a lender. And so what we have here is the lender applies certain underwriting parameters to my project to decide how much they would be willing to lend me. And one thing that I can say universally for lenders is they are risk averse. They do not want to be left holding the bag. So they are going to apply some specific underwriting parameters. They're going to underwrite it in two different ways typically. They're going to underwrite my project based on my project's ability to repay them. That's one way. And they're also going to underwrite my project in terms of how much they could get if they foreclosed on me if I didn't pay. That's the second way. So the bank wants to have two different ways of getting their money back. And that's what we see up here is the two underwriting scenarios on each side. So their preference is that I pay them each year. I pay them the mortgage payment each year. And if all goes according to plan, then what I bring in rents minus all my expenses is still going to give me something left over sufficient to pay them back over a 30-year term. If that doesn't work, the second part of this exercise is what they would get from the building if they foreclosed on me, if I didn't make the payments. So in the first, they will apply some sort of what they call debt coverage ratio. That is my covering their debt service with some cushion over and above that. So they basically want, in the debt coverage ratio exercise, they want to say, I want to make sure this project has net operating income sufficient to cover my annual payment plus something, plus some cushion over and above that. Because if on a year-to-year basis, maybe my debt service payment, the payment they're going to pay to me as a lender is fixed each year, and they have a bad operating year, I don't want their operations to go negative and they don't have enough money to pay my debt service payment, right? And so that cushion is what the debt coverage ratio is. In this case, this lender says, I want your property to have a 20% cushion over and above whatever it is you're paying me in debt service. So that's a 1.2 debt coverage ratio. So what that means is I have a net operating income here, rents minus expenses, of $350,000. And the bank says, that's great. I'm not going to lend you something such that your payment to me each year is $350,000. That won't work. I'm going to lend you something less than that, such that your annual payments are going to be $292,000. Therefore, you will have money left over after you pay me my mortgage payment each year. And that's the 20%. That's your cushion. So my maximum payment to the bank would be the $292,000. That's the debt service that they would be willing. That will equate to a specific loan size when I know what the interest rate of that loan is and how long they're lending it to me. So that's just math that's happening in an Excel spreadsheet you don't have to worry about, but $292,000 of payment will equate to, in this case, a $3.6 million loan. I solved for that at 77% interest and a 30-year fixed. So that is the loan size for $292,000 a year payment. On the right, our market rate example has a lot more net operating income to play with, right? Because they could charge higher rents and their expenses were lower. So they can afford to borrow, using the same underwriting parameters, $7 million to my $3.6 million. So my borrowing capacity for this project is looking to be pretty limited. The second way the lender is going to look at this project, though, remember they want, if I make my payments, that's great. But if I don't make my payments, they may need to foreclose on me. So they're going to look at the value of my property if they had to foreclose. Once again, net operating income, that NOI number, is how we figure out value of the property. So the appraiser will come with what they call a capitalization rate. A cap rate is just what a measure of debt and equity invested in that market in different properties will be. It is not exactly the same as an interest rate, but it does trend with interest. So that's going to help them figure out what the value of the property is in foreclosure. They're going to take the NOI divided by that cap rate, and that's going to give them an appraised value of this property. So the NOI says, the appraiser says the NOI at $351,000 divided by a 7% cap rate in this market is going to get us to an appraised value of $4.6 million. So a bank is going to say, great, your property will be worth $4.6 million. I am not going to lend you $4.6 million. I am not going to lend you 100% of the value, right? A lender is always going to want to stay below that, because if they had to foreclose, they might not recover all of that. So they're going to apply some sort of parameter, like maybe 80% loan to value. How many of you are homeowners? Just threw you a curve. But here's the question. When you borrowed to finance your home, were you able to borrow 100% of the value of the home, the appraised value from the bank? No. It's the same principle or same concept there, right? The bank doesn't want to lend 100% of the appraised value of something. It's going to be something somewhat less than that. So in multifamily, that typically will be 80% loan to value. If we are talking about affordable public subsidy, we may be able to go up to higher than 80%. But this is just the conventional bank we're looking at here. So my maximum loan ends up being, in that case, 80% of my value of 4.6 million. So I'm looking at a max loan of 3.7 million. Well, what I've just done is I've underwritten my project two different ways. The way that you repay me and everything goes according to plan, the way that you don't repay me and I have to foreclose on you. And this bank is going to take the lower of those two loans. They figured out two different loans sizes, and they're going to take the lesser of those two. So my debt capacity turns out to be 3.6 million on the affordable side, because that is how much I can afford to actually repay from operations. And on the market rate side, it's double, almost double that. So now we finally come to what our gap might be and how much else we have to go finance from some other place. So if my conventional loan debt capacity is 3.6 million, I'm then going to need to do all the other fun stuff of fully designing the building and hiring a contractor to tell me how much it's going to cost to build it. So I've really short-circuited that in this example, I'm sorry. But assume that I've done all of that work and I get to a total per unit cost for this of $385,000 per unit. And so I'm building this building for $15,400. Again, this would never happen. And so I need to finance the gap of what I cannot borrow. So I've got to go find another $11.7 million somewhere. On the market rate side, their gap is much smaller. Their gap to finance is only 4.1 million, which they will need to get from some other source as well. Question? Thank you for that question. The question is, why, Michelle, was your development cost per unit so different on the affordable housing project versus the market rate project? If you remember, if you look up here, I had $385,000 per unit to build this affordable housing project, but I had only $280,000 per unit to build the market rate project. Thoughts? I didn't make it up, by the way. That's real. Stuff's real.
Maybe affordable is built to last a long time.
Oh, I love that answer. Right out the gates. The affordable project is built to last. Okay, yes. And yes, yes it is. That is one reason, built to last. Another?
The affordable units going to have more, probably more strict regulations they have to follow when building.
Yes. So the affordable project may have more strict regulations when they are being constructed. Things like energy efficiency standards that come from the funding sources saying, we want you to build as energy efficient a building as you possibly can. So those are strings that come with the funding. Those strings often cost more. Those things that are aspirational for energy efficiency, for example, may be resulting in much more expensive unit production, cost per unit. What else? What are some of the other things that may make an affordable housing project cost more per unit to build? Yeah.
Pre-development costs like environmental stuff and labor rates.
Okay, you said two different things, and we'll take them one at a time. The first thing you said was the pre-development sort of environmental stuff, which is like, for example, environmental cleanup or contamination, things like that, potentially. And then the second thing you said was labor rates, right? Okay, yes and yes, possibly. Most definitely labor rates, because what is one of the other things that we often have to do if we're using public funding for construction? Prevailing wage, exactly. So our prevailing wage rates mean that the public funding that we use, the construction costs have to be paying, the labor rate has to be at a prevailing wage. And the state dictates exactly what that actually means. If we have a federally funded project, that's a whole different wage table, which is called Davis-Bacon wage rates, and that's a federal prevailing wage rate. Depending on what money you have in your project funding construction, you will need to comply with either state prevailing wage rates or federal prevailing wage rates in most cases. Not all, but in most cases. And what that does to a project often is it increases the cost of construction because we are paying labor at a higher wage rate. We're paying ideally at a living wage rate, right? But those wage rates are going to be set. So that could lead to, I'm not going to put any contractors I know in the room on the spot, but if you feel like calling out a percentage premium for a prevailing wage rate versus a market rate project that doesn't have prevailing wages, what would that be? 15 to 20%, he said. Thank you. I actually intended to put you on the spot, so thank you for playing along. Thank you. So it could be 15 to 20% more. I mean, that's a big chunk of this. That's a big chunk of the difference that you're going to see between the cost of building a market rate project and the cost of building an affordable. Additionally, and I will just say this, an affordable project often does have, because we can't raise the rents every year, we do need to build things in a built-to-last sort of way, because we are not going to be able to afford to replace sort of lesser quality finishes or other things as frequently as we could in a market rate project where, I have things that we're going to wear out in 5 years versus 10 years. I can afford to replace them because I'm going to raise rents and I'm going to be able to do that. But I won't have that luxury if I am actually doing this as an affordable project, right? So those are all the kind of challenges that we have that really do result in something costing more. So let's review. Remember what I said when we started this? Building affordable housing, the stuff that we do is so much harder, right? It's so much harder than market rate. For review purposes, we are targeting specific households that we want to house that have the lowest incomes, lower rents. We are not going to be able to raise those rents every year because our funding sources will dictate a cap on escalation. So we're not going to be able to generate as much income from the property. It will likely cost more to operate than the market rate. Therefore, our margin is even smaller, leading us to borrowing a lot less. Our debt capacity, our ability to borrow money to finance this building, is going to be lower. And in addition to that, to top it all off, it also will cost us more to build this. I'm going to give up. Anybody else want to give up at this point? I'm ready to give up. Are you ready to give up? You ready to give up? No? Okay. You have a question?
This is a little bit of a meander, but I was basically curious if there is different demand or different appetite to finance projects based on, are there financiers that are more willing to finance a project that's 30% and lower AMI versus 80% and higher?
That's a great question.
And can that also impact what property results when also accounting like a mission?
Absolutely. So the question is really like, are there certain funding sources that are going to gravitate towards funding a certain type of project, say a 30% area median income housing versus 80% area median income? And then does that basically what you're saying is, does that result in a change or a difference in sort of what we see out there? Yes, absolutely yes. The answer is absolutely yes. On the one hand, and this is going to typically come into play at the public funding level, and public funders, the city, the county, the state, all set their priorities for what they're going to direct their resources towards, right? Public funders in the room? Okay, so you go through a process, yes, each year to set your priorities of where you're going to direct the resources that you have, right? And so that may result in you looking at the community and saying the greatest need is for the very, very lowest income or addressing homelessness or addressing folks at 30% of median, for example. And therefore, we're going to devote some very large percent of our funding towards those types of projects, leaving out or leaving much less funding available for housing at the higher income level, higher end of the spectrum. On a federal level, on a national level, that also results in the largest funding source available, the tax credit program, restricting their units or their funding to households at or below 60% of median. So really the hardest sort of slice of this affordable array of affordable households that we're trying to fund is between 60 and 80% of median income. There's just not a lot of funding available for that level because there's such a great need elsewhere, all the way down the spectrum. So yeah, absolutely, that is an exercise that is done on an annual basis by all of the funders. So what we've got is a problem to solve. So we better get after it. We better start figuring out how to plug that $11.7 million hole. I don't want you to walk out of here without knowing how to do that. I would have failed you miserably. Let's talk about the tools we have in a toolbox. To address the affordability, we're basically trying to solve for what else can we do to get these projects built that our mission is focused on. And we need to understand one basic rule first and foremost, before we do anything else. We need to understand that all development, market rate, affordable, doesn't matter what it is, all development is done in the same market environment. And what that means is that the same market environment I'm building and the for-profit developer is building in the same sort of sphere. The cost of building may be different, but the market that we're playing in is the same. So we're competing with each other for land, often. The basics of the property, the development, is the same. It's really only that extra layer that the public funders may attach on top of that that makes mine cost more. But we're all developing it in the same environment. So we have 3 basic tools in the toolbox, or 3 basic buckets that we can use to address this affordability problem. Number 1, we can try to lower the cost of construction, thereby making the projects cost less to build. You're going to find that that's a very limited set of tools, but we'll talk about them. 2, we can subsidize the development itself, the construction part. We can find a number of tools to help subsidize the cost of construction. And 3rd, we can subsidize the end user, the renter or the buyer. So those are the 3 buckets, and we're going to spend the rest of this time really talking about what those tools are in those three buckets. But what I will say is, universally, all of these solutions involve a lot of complexity and make this much harder, again, much harder than the market rate solution. So talking about lowering costs, I've just told you that we have to pay higher wages, typically prevailing wage rates. We are often needing to do certain things to meet energy efficiency standards, which the market rate developers don't have to do. They're not mandated to do. So what are ways that we could actually lower costs of construction? First of all, we can try to get our public permitting agency to grant lower costs for permit fees or grant waivers of impact fees. Now, impact fees are the kinds of things that are charged by a utility, a sewer water district, or school district, or some other entity that says, hey, you're building here in this area, you're going to be impacting my sewer system, water system, or whatever, so I'm going to charge you some impact fees so that it helps me pay for replacing the sewer plant at some point. But if I'm building affordable housing and I'm saying, hey, you know what, we all care about this. We're all in the same boat of needing to make sure we have affordable, housing in our community. So what say you just kind of waive those fees for my type of development? That is successful in certain areas, and certain jurisdictions have prioritized that and said, hey, we'll waive those types of fees. So you, for affordable housing developer, don't have to pay those. Or a building department could say, hey, we're going to give you some breaks on the actual permit costs. So those are teeny, teeny, tiny impact. Not saying I'm ungrateful for it, but they're going to result in a very minimal impact to the cost of construction. But we got to chip away at this, right? So those are some things we can do to lower cost. Potentially a much bigger thing that we can do is remove the cost of land from the budget, from the equation. One way I can do that is to convince somebody to give me land. I could strong arm someone into giving me land. Policy-wise, I mean. I don't really mean strong arm, I just mean policy-wise. A good example of that in the Puget Sound region is Sound Transit, which is our light rail and regional transit authority. They have a policy that has come after much advocacy and lobbying, that if they have properties they bought up to help construct their light rail line, and then they're done with that property at the end, the first use of that surplus property is to affordable housing. They have to give it to affordable housing developers or sell it at a super, super, super low cost. So I'm getting land for almost nothing in those circumstances. Another way I could do it is to have just a long-term ground lease. I could have an entity that has some excess land and says, yeah, I don't want to totally just give it up and sell it to you, but I'm willing to lease it to you for $1 a year for the next 99 years. Housing authorities may have surplus land that they can do this with for other developers. Churches is another good example of a source that may do this, where you provide some long-term access to property the church has but doesn't want to give up, but they will lease it to the developer for basically the useful life of the building, something like 99 years. So now I've taken the cost of land out of the equation. That's big. That could be really considerable in terms of helping me lower my cost. So those are just good, sort of good strategies. And on the homeownership side, what we frequently find is the structure of what they call community land trusts. So I am not actually ever going to be passing on the cost of the land to the home buyer when they buy that property. Instead, the underlying land under the houses is going to be held in trust by some entity. And so the house that's on that land is what the home buyer is buying. And they're buying a share of the underlying landowner housing land trust. So that could cut 20–25% off the cost of the per unit, possibly. That's a significant way to decrease the cost. And the last couple ways here are more about building more on a smaller plot of land. So increasing density. And so if I have a 1 acre parcel and I've got zoning that says I can build 20 units on it, well, let's increase the density. Let's get the sort of zoning change that would allow for us to build 50 units on that property. I maybe can go higher in building something. I now have the same land cost, but I've spread it out over more units. Therefore, I've decreased the cost per unit, right? Okay, these are good tools. However, they will often not result in a huge moving of the needle. So we've got these other tools in the other toolboxes we're going to need to turn to, in addition to the lowering of costs. Let's go to the next one, addressing the affordability by subsidizing the actual construction. So this is where all those fancy financing tools that we all are familiar with, or some of us are familiar with, this is where all of these come in. The subsidies that we're talking about are the public funding sources, as opposed to, say, your just conventional bank source, right? All of these other public funding sources that will either be helping to fund our projects at no interest. They may be loans that charge 0% interest as opposed to a bank's 5 or 6 or 7 or whatever. Or they may even be funding sources that say, I'm going to make this loan to you, but I'm going to defer payments for 15 years or 20 years or something. So I don't even have to make interest or debt service payments to them. That can help me just have much more money left over for my operating expenses, right? So there's a number of tools in this bucket. And the main sources that we're going to talk about are the city, county, state housing trust fund. That's kind of the public financing, public loan sources. And those typically will provide terms into my projects that require affordability for a certain length of time in exchange for providing funding that is at either 0% interest or 1% interest or deferred interest, and I don't have to make payments, or something that's truly beneficial to how I'm going to operate the project without having to pay them back. And then the next category is low-income housing tax credit equity. And so the low-income housing tax credit program we're going to talk about as a program that brings something in the order of 25 to 50% of the funding that I'm going to need to construct these projects. We also will talk about, we've talked already about conventional debt, the conventional bank loan. That still does play a role in some of our projects, but it may be in the form of a tax-exempt loan as opposed to a taxable loan. The only difference there, for your purposes, is the interest rate will be different. The interest rate will be less. But I may still need to borrow. And then last but not least, we may have some amount of our own developer money that is left in the project and gets paid out over time. So we call that a source as well. So really, I'm really talking about addressing the subsidy of the development by layering in all of these other funding sources on top of whatever I can borrow from the bank in order to get to that full $15 million project cost. Okay? And just since you asked and you brought up the question about the income targeting and who prioritizes for what, there are very few sources that will cover that 60 to 80% of AMI, as we mentioned. But there are some sources, and so that has its own category down here on this table because there's very few of the other sources up above are available for the projects that are targeting folks at 61 to 80% of area median income. But if you are building a project like that, know that there are some programs, federal programs mainly, that are available at that income level. And there are some private sources as well. And the largest of these in the most sort of recent number of years is Amazon. Amazon has what they call their Housing Equity Fund, which is just a program that they are funding housing up to 80% of area median income in certain communities. So I mentioned Amazon, and Microsoft also has a similar type of initiative that it's doing. Questions on that? Okay. And on the home ownership side, there's a couple of things I would say. There's limited resources, probably more limited resources, but at the state level and federally, there are programs available to subsidize the construction of these for sale homes. And all of these would be dictating the income levels of the households as they buy them, and they would be paid back or deferred and not paid back, depending on the type of program you're talking about, in the same way that we're talking about multifamily affordable housing as well. So a quick little primer, because this is alphabet soup time. For all these funding sources, every one of them has an acronym, and you have to know all these acronyms in order to sound conversant, and you should have a cheat sheet for that, and everybody should have some sort of glossary of terms that you have at your desk, and so you can just rattle these things off. But I'll just cover a few. On the local or county administered sources, many of the sources, and especially as you get outside of communities like Spokane, Seattle, Everett, Pierce County, Tacoma, the sources that the local jurisdiction has available are typically federal sources that are getting passed through the city. So the city will administer, for example, HUD funding in the form of either the Community Development Block Grant Program, which is the oldest of those, or the HOME program, which is also a major source of funding for homeownership and rental housing. HUD typically is not administering these directly. They're passing these through the cities or counties. Depending on the size of the population in those communities, they will either be directly or federally administered. But if I'm applying to the city of Tacoma, for example, or if I'm applying to the city of Spokane County, chances are I'm using funding that is actually federal funding that is passed through. And the city's the one administering it. In addition to that, there are other sources in local jurisdictions that have approved housing levies, like the city of Seattle, where they get a voter-approved levy every 7 years that can be renewed, and the voters say, yes, we'll tax ourselves to create a pot of money that will be available for affordable housing. Other communities have done this as well. So that can be another source, which is a non-federal source, meaning it can have all kinds of other flexibility, just depending on what the local jurisdiction has decided in terms of its use. At the state level, there are a number of different sources that the State Department of Commerce administers that include federal sources, as well as general fund derived sources that the state legislature approves, and specific fees that are assessed on things like the document recording fees. Every time a property sells, there is a slice of however many cents or percentage, 0.5 cents or whatever, that goes to recording the documents for that sale, and then that money comes back to the Department of Commerce to administer to build housing. So there's a number of things like that and different resources that the city, the local, county, and state level have available. In addition, the state-administered sources of the general fund derived include the Housing Trust Fund, which has a number of programs. And as we talked about how each jurisdiction or each funding source establishes what they're going to spend money on, that is done by typically an annual process to figure out, okay, what are we going to prioritize this year? That's based on, typically on need. What are the greatest needs out there? That's what we're going to prioritize our money for. So each of these sources will sort of dictate or determine how they're going to spend their money, and you really need to be able to be familiar with that to know whether or not your project's going to qualify or you're going to be able to apply for it. The other state-administered source that's up here, the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, is actually a federal program, but it is administered at the state level. And so that is administered by the Washington State Housing Finance Commission, WSFC, and they are basically allocating the amount that the state receives in tax credits each year in either a competitive way or a competitive way. That was an inside joke. Some of you will be able to laugh at this, and others of you will not understand what I mean. But there's a 4% program and there's a 9% program. The 9% program is a competitive program, and the 4% program is a competitive program. So they're all competitive now. They didn't used to be. But there are various programs of the federal housing tax credit programs that are administered through the state. Different rules apply in terms of the types of the income level that you're targeting, and then the other priorities that the state wants to fund, and that varies from the state of Washington to the state of California to the state of Kansas, where they sit in a room and they decide which projects are going to get funded this year, and that's it. That was a true story also. So these are all things that you would need to familiarize yourself with in terms of what the priorities are, and then you would know, does my project actually qualify for the source this year or not? And can we go after that as a funding source? And then there are other federal programs that are administered at the federal level, depending on that are funding specific types of housing. So HUD does directly administer what they call the 811 or the 202 housing programs, and these are for housing for folks with disabilities, that's the 811 program, and or housing for seniors, that's the 202 program. So those are things that are still administered at a federal level in our region, and there's multiple regions of HUD that are actually directly administering these. Similarly, on the home ownership side, the federally administered programs include FHA and VA, and those are mortgage programs, and USDA, which is a rural development program for production of both rental housing and home ownership, depending on your location. Lots of different acronyms, and lots of different sources. So as we're layering together the rest of the financing that we're going to chase, being able to be familiar with these different programs is helpful. And typically the first door in to access these programs would be your local jurisdictions, to understand what they administer and what they don't and where else to go after that. Okay? So, I'm not going to do all that work in front of you, but what I will say is I just did all that work before I came, and I created a couple of typical sort of what we call capital stack, how I've actually financed this project that we were noodling on earlier on the capital development side. And so in this case, I have a project that is, and this is just to illustrate kind of how you might layer multiple different funding sources for different types of projects. This case is an example project where I'm building 100 units, and I'm going to be targeting that to households at or below 30% of area median income. So folks who really are maybe coming out of homelessness, or maybe they have 0% AMI. Maybe they're at 0% AMI, zero income. But they're at the lowest sort of income level, and they may also have additional needs that are needing to be provided as services in the housing. So this project that we are building is going to cost a little more per unit. That's the first thing you should notice there. My per unit cost on this project is actually looking to be $500,000 a unit. So I've now got a $50 million project here that I'm building. Well, where am I going to go to get those resources? In this example, I am going to be able to tap my local jurisdiction, city and county, maybe in this case, for funds that they have available, that they've prioritized for folks at the lowest income level. And remember, again, if there's the greatest need in some community for a certain type of housing, chances are there is more available to fund that type of housing, right? So in this case, I am going to be able to access about $15 million for this project because of those factors. At the state level, I am going to go for the maximum that Commerce, the State Housing Trust Fund, the Department of Commerce, has available right now on a per project basis. And that happens to be $5 million. So I throw that in there on top of that stack. That means the rest, in this case, is going to need to come from low-income housing tax credit program. And so I am going to compete for an allocation of tax credits with my State Housing Finance Commission. And because I'm serving this income level and providing all of these services to this population, my project is going to score off the charts. And I'm building a green building, let's not forget. I'm building a very green building, and what else am I doing? I'm doing all kinds of things. I'm checking every single box I can possibly check to be the most competitive project in this round, and therefore I get the tax credits, which I am then going to sell to an investor, and they're going to give me equity to build the project, $30 million in this case. So now I have a fully funded project. The next example is a project that is targeting families at or below 60% of area median income. And so that is actually not going to have any services necessarily, no special needs population, but it is going to have households who are going to be able to pay some rent. The cost to develop this project is going to be a little bit less probably because I am not providing social service space in this project. It's really just going to be kind of your typical apartment building with some nice common area amenities, but it is not going to have the program space that I might need to have in a supportive housing project. So $480,000 per unit, still pretty steep. My sources to pay for this project are going to come from, again, I'm probably going to be able to tap the city And because I'm still providing housing at or below 60% of median, there is still a need. Maybe I'm also providing large family units, which are not really prevalent in the market. So the city is going to say, oh, yes, we have prioritized some funding for you to make these units available. I'm going to also tap the State Housing Trust Fund. Again, I may not get as much for this. I may not be as competitive. I probably would go for the maximum. But in this case, we're tapping them for $3 million. Notice this, though, on the tax credit side, I'm still going to approach the Housing Finance Commission to get an allocation of tax credits, but in this case, it's going to be 4% tax credits, which is a different type of tax credit than the 9%. What that means is it's going to provide less in tax credits and less in equity than the 9% program will. I will answer the question that is all on the top of your minds right now in a minute. But I'll tell you what your question is first. 4% of what, Michelle? 9% of what? You were thinking that, weren't you? Yeah, okay, good. I'll answer that in a minute. So, but I'm tapping the 4% program. I'll be able to generate equity of not 30 million in this case, but just under half of that amount. And in addition to that, I will be required to borrow, because the 4% tax credit program requires that it be paired with tax-exempt bond financing. What is a tax-exempt bond? Anyone? It's a loan. It's a loan. Tax-exempt bond financing is just a loan, and it is a loan at a tax-exempt rate. A tax-exempt rate just means it's a lower interest rate than a regular bank loan. Anyone tries to get jargony on you and get more fancy than that? It is not more fancy than that. That is essentially what a tax-exempt bond is. It is a lower interest rate loan. It's tax-exempt, so it qualifies because it meets certain different criteria, but it is just meaning that it's a loan at a lower interest rate, okay? I have to use that when I use the 4% low-income housing tax credit program, though. That is the rule. So those things get paired together, and I'll need to qualify how much I can borrow by doing that whole exercise we just did before this, looking at our operating budget. How much can I charge in rent? How much are my operating expenses going to be? Do I have anything left over for debt service? That debt service is going to go to paying back that $30 million loan in this case. Okay? And I still have a little bit of gap that I'm going to need to throw in some other source here. That other source in this case could be some other funding program like Amazon, if I'm so lucky to have Amazon Housing Equity Fund. It may also be a deferred developer loan, meaning I, as the developer, am going to just leave money in the project and not get it paid back to me right at the completion, and instead, I will get that back over time, meaning I've just become another funding source to my own project. Okay? So that becomes a source that I put up there. So that's just two examples of how, again, to fund different types of projects and what a typical funding strategy or funding plan may actually look like for building the building. Questions? Yes?
So I know you go to the commission for tax credit. The tax-exempt bond financing, is that through the commission?
It is. So the Housing Finance Commission administers the 4% and the 9% tax credit program, and along with the 4% tax credit program, the state has what they call bond allocation, which means every year the state has the ability to approve an amount of borrowing for the purpose of producing housing. And so it's a capped, finite amount, and they are going to then allocate that through a competitive round with the 4% tax credits. So they have a competition each year to allocate the actual debt capacity or debt allocating the debt authority there. So that is administered at the Housing Finance Commission, and the bond allocation amount is determined by per capita allocation. Per capita meaning how many people do we have in our state? That population size is going to determine the amount of bond allocation authority they're able to issue in that case. There are other ways to actually fund that chunk if you are different, depending on the type of entity you are, beyond the State Housing Finance Commission. But suffice to say, for the majority of us as developers, we would be accessing bond allocation through WISHFIC. Jeff, do you have a question? The equity is, yes. Is there any equity in these situations? Yes. Yes and yes. So equity in this case comes from the tax credit, selling the tax credits themselves. So in this budget, my equity chunk is 14.4 million. My source for that equity is going to be an investor that buys the tax credits, which is the next few slides. In the previous example, I had even more equity in my homeless housing, service-enriched housing project. I was selling 9% tax credits, and I was able to generate 30 million of equity. Again, that equity will come from an institutional investor that invests that 30 million in my project. They don't get paid back as a loan, because it's not a loan. It's equity, but they will buy an ownership share in my project, and they'll get their money back in a different way, or the return. Okay? What are tax credits? What is she talking about here? What is she talking about when she says 4% tax credits and 9% tax credits? For heaven's sakes. Simply, the description of a tax credit is, everybody's familiar with tax credits in some way or other, right? There's all kinds of different tax credits out there available in the world. But the program that we're talking about here is the low-income housing tax credit. And in this case, we understand first what a tax credit is and then what the low-income housing program is. A tax credit of any type is actually a dollar-for-dollar reduction in someone's tax bill, in someone's tax liability, okay? So if I get a tax credit, if I'm eligible for any kinds of tax credits, it is going to reduce my taxes that I owe, dollar for dollar, by the amount of tax credits I get, okay? That is distinguished from a tax deduction. Now, if you are like kind of doing your own taxes, anybody do their own taxes in here? If you do your own taxes and say one of your tax deductions that you're figuring and you do your Schedule A or whatever that thing is with your 1040 and you say, I give to charity, and so I'm going to calculate how much I give to charity every year, and I'm going to go through that little form that they have there to figure out what my tax deduction is for my charitable contributions, my charitable giving, right? It takes you to a spreadsheet, you do some math, and it tells you to like cross this T and borrow this and just bring the one up here and whatever, and you're going to like multiply it by some fractions, and at the bottom, whatever you put in terms of your donations does not come out as a dollar for dollar reduction of your tax bill. It's some fraction of that you get as a deduction, right? Small deduction. A tax credit, by contrast, is if I've invested something and I buy this and I get a tax credit, I am reducing my tax liability by $1 for every dollar of tax credits I have. So it's a much bigger benefit. So this program, this low-income housing tax credit program, has been around since the early 80s. And at this point, it's safe to say that it is the largest source of funding for housing, affordable multifamily housing at or below 60% of area median income in the country. This is the largest source to fund all the production of affordable housing at or below 60% of area median income for multifamily. It's only available for multifamily, and it is only available to produce housing at or below 60% of area median income. So the states administer the program. It is a figment of the IRS. It's a creature of the IRS, but the states administer it. And basically, what it is the federal government had said at some point, this grand idea of saying, you know, We used to fund directly. We funded affordable housing production directly through HUD. But there's so much need, there's so much cost. We're going to devise a plan where we just take in less in taxes and have somebody else fund that production. And they will get a tax break. We will charge them less in taxes. That is, in a nutshell, what this program's core function is and how it works. So those that fund the production of affordable housing now get a tax break, and they have to pay less in taxes. Who are these angels? Who are these people who fund the production now? Who are the ones putting in the equity? Banks, insurance companies, I've heard, yes. Anybody else? Corporations, sure, some, yes. Yes. I'll call them institutional investors. How about that? Institutional investors who have a huge tax liability otherwise. They would have a lot that they owe in taxes were they not to do this, participate in this program and get some tax break, okay? Federal government says, well, you don't have to pay as much in taxes if you invest in these very specific things that we have sanctioned that are going to produce affordable housing, and you go through all this and we have a very lawyer and accountant heavy program that we've set up here, and if you play by these rules and administer this, we will give you a lower tax liability. So what is basically happening is the states are getting an allocation of the credits to sell. Each state, again, based on their population or per capita. Where in Montana, where there are more cows than people, they have one of the lowest levels of tax credits. Ditto for Hawaii, where they don't have as many cows, but they also just don't have a lot of people. They have a low allocation statewide of tax credits. The larger your state, the more people, the more in tax credits this state will have to administer. And in Washington, the State Housing Finance Commission will administer these tax credits by holding a competitive round. We at the project level compete for an allocation of tax credits. If we are so fortunate that our project qualifies, we will be awarded those tax credits in the competitive round, and then we will have tax credits. And most of our developers are nonprofits, and they don't pay taxes. So what do we do? That sounds useless. That sounds useless. What do we do? My project gets an allocation of tax credits. I don't pay taxes. I can't use those. Sell them. Okay. That's what the program syndication is. When I, as the project owner, developer, a nonprofit, get an allocation of these tax credits for my project, I need to go find someone to sell them to. I'm selling the tax credits that the commission has just awarded me. And I need to find an institutional investor who has a lot of tax liability. And I say, hey, bank, I have this project here that's got an allocation of tax credits. It's got 10 years worth of tax credits. That's how much I get. I bundle all of that up together, and I say, I will sell that to you today for something. You give me that money up front. I build my building. You become an owner. The investor will become an owner with me in the project. So this project will now be owned by what we call a partnership, a tax credit partnership. And the partners in that partnership will be me as the nonprofit and that institutional investor. We will be partners together in this project, owning it together, because the investor does not get tax credits on that unless they are an owner. The tax credits flow through them, through the ownership. And so they need to be part of that ownership structure. So an investor is going to pay some chunk of money up front to receive tax credits, meaning a reduction in their tax bill, each year for 10 years. They have to stay in that ownership structure for that 10-year period and then some. Another 5 years is what the IRS says. Why? It's just what the IRS says, okay? Don't ask me. It's just what the IRS says. But that is the rule. Well, also that, but it's because that is the program. And I can actually answer the question, but it doesn't matter. The IRS says that the partnership needs to hold together for 15 years. So the investor is only receiving 10 years worth of tax credits, but they still have to stay in this relationship for another 5, just to make it look like there was some other economic substance besides just buying the tax credits. Somehow they care. So that's the deal. So this investor will pay this equity, though, up front. Essentially, over the course of the building of the project and the lease up of the project, they will be paying us this $30 million in that first example, which will become one of my funding sources. And then they will receive their tax credits over time for the next 10 years. Okay? And that's true with both the 9% tax credit program and the 4% tax credit program. And I still haven't told you 9% of what or 4% of what, but I'll get to that. Question?
Is there a chart somewhere that says how the tax credits are allocated, or how WishFit comes up with for a certain project, how much that project gets and how much this project gets? Is it determined on total development cost or what?
Is there a chart or a formula, maybe, that determines how much in tax credits get awarded to Project A versus Project B, right? Apart from them being competitive and winning the beauty contest. Yes. And it is based on total development cost and a fraction of that. And you've just started to answer the question about 9% of what and 4% of what. Good job. So, but before I go there, this tax credit ownership structure, I just wanted to say one more thing about it. This relationship that we have to have with these institutional investors. The investor that's going to be putting this $30 million into the project is going to own the lion's share of this project. They are going to own actually 99.99% of the project during the time that they're in this partnership with me. I, the nonprofit, will own 0.01%. My role, though, is to be the manager of the partnership. I will have all of the work. I will have all of the responsibility for delivering the building, leasing it up, operating it, and making sure the financials and everything else always stays in compliance. So I, the 0.01% member, are considered the general partner, and I will have all the active responsibility in the partnership. The investor, by contrast, will have all of that 99.99% ownership, which means that they are going to be able to get 99.99% of the tax credits flowing to them. Because typically that benefit is going to follow the ownership. But they cannot be active in the project, meaning they can't step in and finish developing it for me, they can't operate it for me, they can't do anything active in the running of this partnership. The reason is because this program offsets passive income, and they have to stay passive in order for that to qualify. So the investor can't actually step in and replace me. They could replace me, but they can't step in and do it for me. So this partnership does revolve around being able to underwrite my capacity to do the job that the investor can't do, but it's a job that's so important to them because it does mean that they get or don't get their tax credits. So that goes to a whole other sort of category of capacity. When we talk about the organizations that are entering these partnerships and being the general partner, the investor is going to want to know that you can do that. And if you can't do it, they're going to want to know that you have a buddy, a co-general partner that can do that. So the capacity to do all of the responsibilities, the things that you're going to have to do to build the building, complete it, lease it up, and operate it, is all going to be things that the investor is going to evaluate you on because it's important to whether or not they get or don't get those tax credits over the next 10 years. Good? So how do we actually, 9% of what? Let's answer that question finally. Tax credits are figured on basically the budget that I have, the development budget. There is a subset of the development costs in that budget that are going to be eligible to receive the tax credit. And so when I go and I figure out my development budget, when I put together all the costs that are going to go into actually building the building, there is going to be a subset of costs in there that are going to be eligible for the tax credit. And that subset of costs is going to have a number, that dollar amount, and the tax credits I am awarded are going to be 9% of that number. So the 9% program, I'm going to get 9%, I'm going to get tax credits worth 9% of the subset of costs I have in my development budget that are eligible for those credits. And on the 4% side, it's the same thing, but in there, I'm going to get 4%. I'm going to get tax credits worth 4% of the subset of development budget costs I have. And that's how we figure out how much tax credits are actually awarded on a project-by-project basis. The commission will look at our budget. We will have calculated that. Here are our costs. Here's 4% of that. That's how much is the maximum I could get in the form of tax credits. A couple other things to know about these two programs. In the 9% program, you are typically funding homeless, low-income, that's the priorities that, extremely low-income households, that is the priorities that have been established by WSFIC in this state. And on the 4% side, since you have to use a loan source as well, tax-exempt bonds, you will have to be able to support some debt, meaning you're going to have higher rents that can actually bring in rental income to support debt. So that's kind of why you had the sort of profile of the two different projects that we talked about and the types of tax credits that they're going for. But each of those, the 4% and the 9%, are each going to be tax credits that are available to the project each year for 10 years. So the commonality of those two programs is they are both 10-year tax credits. They get 10 years worth of the tax credit awarded to the project. And that's what I'm going to bundle up and sell to the investor. Questions on that? Let's go back. Yes. I went through that kind of fast, didn't I? Well, yes, it would, but it's 4% as an annual tax credit. Yes, that is value. Well, it's just 4% because what we do is we figure out what the annual tax credit is. And so the annual amount that I'm getting is going to be of tax credit worth 4% of some subset of my budget. So say I had a $10 million development budget. Well, now I'm putting myself on the spot because I'm going to have to figure out math. Say I had a $10 million development budget. Right, so the basis, first you inserted jargon, so I want to go back to what basis is. So I have a budget that's 10 million, and a subset of that budget is actually eligible for the tax credit. That subset, let's call it 8 million, is the basis, the eligible basis for the tax credit. So now 8 million is the eligible basis, and I'm going to get tax credit, annual tax credits worth 4% of that, right? Which is, thank you, $320,000 a year. I'm going to get $320,000 a year times 10 years, or 3.2 million, and that's what I have as far as total tax credits available to sell to an investor, who's going to give me some subset, cents on the dollar, discounted amount for that today, because they're not getting all their tax credits at this minute, right? They're going to get them spread out over 10 years. So they're not going to give me a dollar for dollar on that. They're going to give me 90 cents on the dollar today. So I get their 90 cents on 3.2 million. I can build my building with that. They get their tax credits over time. Okay? The last bucket that we have available, before I lose you, is the subsidizing of the renter or buyer, the end user. And so here, this is not insignificant either. There are a number of programs available to do this. And it is important because, let's take that family housing example, for example, the 4% tax credit deal, which was funding family affordable housing for households at 60% of area median income. If I have households there that really can't afford the rent that I need to charge, I may be able to access a rental housing subsidy that will get me to market rent, and that household will still only have to pay 30% of their income. And I still get the rental revenue for full freight, if you will, which can then help me afford the debt that I'm going to borrow, right? That's one option, is a rental subsidy that subsidizes the renter and allows me to have the operating income that I need to service debt. The second example would be operating subsidies for, and this is typically for housing that is providing services. There may be an operating subsidy to the building, not to the renter, that no matter what the rents are, I have my rents and my expenses, and then I get some chunk of subsidy allocated to this so that I am break even, whatever it is. And those are going to be programs that are typically prioritized for providing a certain type of housing, and often that is a supportive housing type of project, or a project with households with special needs. These are very limited resources, but if you are in a geography or in an area that has those operating subsidies, that can really make the difference between being able to operate those types of projects or not. On the homeownership side, we're typically, in funding or subsidizing the end user, we're talking about giving a second mortgage to a buyer that can afford X amount, but that's not enough to buy the house. So we give them a soft second mortgage that will help get them over the hump of the house cost. And that second mortgage will sit there and not have to be repaid. So that's one type of assistance. And the other type of assistance on the mortgage, on the homeownership side, is a down payment assistance. Maybe that household can't come up with the down payment that's needed, but there are programs that can actually provide that down payment source. So again, that's subsidizing the end user on the homeownership side. Did you have a question? Okay. 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 So this is an example of the operating pro forma, that operating budget we started with at the beginning. And this is one that has an operating subsidy. So this is the type of budget where I'm, say, providing housing to maybe a population with some supportive service needs. And my renters are not going to get a rental subsidy, but whatever my overall rent is that I'm charging, in this case, say, $228 per unit per month, I'm not bringing in a whole lot of rental income from my tenants, but I am getting an additional subsidy from a jurisdiction because I'm providing some certain set of services. And so I get some chunk, defined chunk every year of subsidy to operate the building. That total income then, minus whatever my operating expenses are, minus my reserves, gets me to a net operating income, in this case, $630,000, and then I can use that to pay for my resident services. So this operating subsidy here is actually providing me subsidy for both the operating and the service costs. It's not on a per unit basis. It's not defining, specifically, what the renter is getting. It's just the operations are being subsidized. And it's doing so to get me to break even. You see that? 0, big red goose egg down at the bottom. That's what this subsidy is typically going to do. It's not going to give me cash flow available after that, but it is going to be enough to actually get the building's operations covered. The other example is a typical project with a renter subsidy, in this case the HUD Section 8 program, where I'm getting the number of units that I have subsidized with Section 8. So whoever comes into my building, they can make whatever they're earning some lower income level and they're not able to pay the rent I'm charging, but that doesn't matter because I have a per unit rental subsidy that's going to come and cover whatever the difference is between what they can pay in rent and what my rent actually is. And what do I get as the landlord? I get full rent on each unit because of the layer of Section 8 subsidy on top of the renter's payment. So this will enable me to provide resource for all of my operating expenses, you can see here, and I will have net operating income at the end, which then I can use to pay debt service, because this is typically going to be the project where I am borrowing some amount of money from the tax-exempt bond program or some other program, and I have to pay that back. So that rental subsidy will then be able to be used as debt service. Okay? These are just two examples of typical budget, operating side budgets for the super, super low income service enriched housing versus maybe the family housing with a little higher income level. Questions? Yeah?
Just general questions. I mean, you kind of compared the market rate and affordable at the beginning where
Yeah.
affordable about to cost more funding stacks and lower NOI.
Right.
This sounds pretty, I don't know where bad is the right word, but it's
Bad? No, it's daunting. It's daunting.
compared to
Yes.
market rate.
Yes.
Putting the, let's say, nonprofit missions aside that provide low-income housing, what would you say the pros of jumping into affordable housing development compared to the market rate?
If you don't have mission as part of that, I cannot sell this to you. I mean, in all seriousness, there is no reason to do this. It isn't, it's not going to enrich you. It is about meeting mission. It is completely about meeting mission. It doesn't mean that you will go broke if you are actually operating these properties and providing enough, sort of careful planning and execution. You probably won't go broke, maybe, probably, but you will not ever get rich. So, I mean, this is about mission. Delivering these projects is about mission at the end of the day. So what have we learned? Please tell me something. So in order to execute all of these projects, I think that you do need to come to the table with a variety of things, tools in your toolbox. We've talked about a number of those today, but the important things to understand is that we need to try to be innovative in reducing costs where we can. That's going to be a limited array of tools that we have to bring, but we will do what we can there. We will then need to be very familiar with a whole host of development subsidies and different programs that will help add complexity, but also subsidize the cost of construction. And then in addition to that, we will need to understand where and how we can access dedicated sources to fund the ongoing operations of these projects, whether it's in rental subsidies or operating subsidies. So that familiarity with that whole set of tools is really what's necessary to kind of pull together all of these projects and make them successful. Questions? All right. You guys have been wonderful. Thank you. Oh,
There you go.
mic drop. I am available to answer questions after this if you all have questions. I'm happy to sit up here and answer whatever I missed. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Please joining me in thanking Michelle for her time. You already gave her a round of applause. Let's give her another one. There was just one question in the Whova app about whether slides will be available. Slides will be available from all of the sessions of Housing Washington, so stay tuned. I'm not sure if it'll be in the app or it'll be on the housingwashington.org website. But yeah, we will have all the presentations available in short order. And if you want to know more about how to find a buddy and be a buddy, if you want to get into this, come to our session tomorrow morning at 11:10 in this room about emerging developers, partnerships, and programs to help build that capacity. Thank you all for coming. Please give session feedback through the Whova app and join us for their opening reception.